Hey everybody, Peter Maravelis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that continues in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the summer season. So as the city begins to reopen, finally, I'd like to remind everyone that the bookstore is once again open for business. Our hours are 7 days a week from 12 noon until 8 p.m. You will once again be able to browse our eclectic stacks. Please do wear facial covering when visiting the store in respect for all of those that may still be at risk. We would appreciate it. So tonight's event is a type of a homecoming for us. City Lights has been friends of the Talbot family for many, many years. David has had his offices just down the street from City Lights at the historic Zoetrope building. So we really are neighbors in the literal sense. We've also hosted many, many past events for David. So tonight we are delighted to welcome Margaret Talbot to the City Lights orbit as well. They have co-authored a remarkable and important new book, which we are honored to be celebrating with his launch party. The book is called By the Light of Burning Dreams, The Triumphs and Tragedies of the Second American Revolution. It is published by Harper Collins, and via extensive research, utilizing exclusive interviews, original documents, archival research, and so on. The book explores the political landscape of the 60s and 70s, focusing on critical moments in the lives of a diverse group of activist leaders of the 20th century radical movement. And these include people like Bobby Seale of the Black Panthers, Heather Booth, the Jane Collective, activists such as Tom Hayden, Jane Fonda, Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, as many, many others as well. So Margaret and David have looked at what it was that galvanized these modern revolutionaries and created unexpected connections and alliances between individual movements and across race, class, and gender divides. So they've performed a really great service in giving us a lucid account of one of the most dynamic eras of the 20th century, but also a kind of a blueprint for activism that by exploring some defining radical moments, it offers us parallel and lessons for today. So I'd like to give you a little bit of background about our speakers tonight. To give you a little bit of background, David Talbot is the author of the New York Times bestseller Brothers, The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years, and the acclaimed national bestseller Season of the Witch, Enchantment, Terror, and Deliverance in the City of Love. He is the founder and former co-editor-in-chief of Salon, and was a senior editor at Mother Jones and the features editor at the San Francisco Examiner. He has written for The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, Time, The Guardian, and other major publications. He makes his home in San Francisco. Margaret Talbot is a staff writer at The New Yorker since 2004. Previously, she was contributing editor at the New York Times Magazine, and from 1995 through 1999, an editor at The New Republic. Her features cover legal issues, social policy, and popular culture, and have appeared in the Times Magazine, the New Republic, the Atlantic Monthly, National Geographic, and the Times Book Review. She was one of the founding editors of Lingua Franca and was a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. In 1999, she received a Whiting Writers Award. She is the author of The Entertainer, Movies, Magic, and My Father's 20th Century about Lyle Talbot, her father. Before we begin, I would like to mention that we'll be posting.
I was going to say, and also David's father.
He is same father.
Okay.
I want
So-
to make that clear,
Yeah,
as we know.
and so before we begin, I would like to mention that we'll be posting links for you to purchase books in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. It can be activated just by kind of scrolling your mouse over the bottom of the panel. There's also going to be a Q&A at the end of the discussion, so please do post your comments and your questions in that very same chat function. So it is a great homecoming, a delight and an honor to have you both with us here today, gracing our virtual halls. Margaret Talbot, David Talbot, welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you,
Thank
Peter.
you.
Great to be back,
It
even if
really
it's
is.
virtual. Love
Well,
to
it
be
is a great, great pleasure for us too. And like I said earlier, as we were in the green room, you know, the only thing it's missing is a trip down to Zoetrope for a bottle of wine afterwards, but looking forward to better days and give you a rain check on that one. So first of all, congratulations to you both on this great achievement. I mean, this is a very dense, very rich history, or I should say a set of histories. So I'd really love to learn, as I think many of the people in the room would, how did this project emerge? I mean, how did the two of you go about and organizing it? I mean, it just seems so massive.
Well, I'll jump in because it started with me. If he's somewhere lurking out there, I want to give a shout out to our editor at Harper Collins, Jennifer Barth. It happened over lunch at Zuni, actually, that wonderful restaurant, to give a plug for another local institution that's bouncing back from the pandemic. And Jennifer and I had lunch there, I think maybe it was 2016. And it was her idea to do a book about sort of modeled on Joseph Ellis's book, Founding Brothers, about the first American Revolution, sort of the key movers and shakers behind that revolution. And it was Jennifer's idea to look at the second revolution, the one in the 1960s and 70s, look at the leading figures, men and women this time, who were so key to making the second revolution happen. And I thought that was a great idea. And I leapt right into it, started researching, interviewed a number of people. Thank God, some of them before they died, like Dennis Banks of the American Indian Movement. And then I had a stroke in November 2017. And some of my fans out there may know that I did have a stroke back then. I wrote a book about it, a memoir. I seemed to not be able to stop writing even after my stroke, but I did know that I needed some help. And it was, writing a history book, particularly a book of this nature, is a real challenge. And I hadn't done all the research yet. I'd done some of it, but to complete it, I knew I needed help, and help that I could really count on. And frankly, only help that a family member could supply. And fortunately, I had such a family member, my sister, Margaret, and Arthur Allen, her husband, who's the kind of a silent partner here. Both of them, agreed to help me out and to write part of the book, to research and write part of the book. And I couldn't have done it without both of them. Particularly Margaret, who did a major part of the book and collaborated with me, edited what I wrote, I edited what she wrote before we handed it in. And so it was very much a kind of a mind meld, something that, the Everly brothers could do because they were brothers, sing in unison. And so Margaret was my other Everly brother, even though she's a sister. And so that's how we did it. We wrote it together. Margaret, you might want to add something.
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, it was actually a wonderful chance to get to work with David. And we'd never really, although we've always been close, we had never collaborated on a project before. So that was something I was really happy to be able to do. And also, I loved the idea for this book that it was going to focus on these different people at kind of different activists at sort of turning points in their lives. And I'm always interested in kind of the emotional work that goes on when somebody decides to turn their life over to something bigger and become an activist and step out of the ordinary run of things and their ordinary life, and what it takes and what it how it resonates in their life overall, and and in their personal relationships. And so it just seemed like a way to do that too, because of the way the book was set out, looking at these different characters at turning points. So then I stepped in and started doing some of the kinds of research that David had already been doing in archives. And fortunately, it was before the pandemic, so you could still get into archives and interviewing people, interviewing activists.
And really,
I was going to add, Peter, in a way, my stroke was a stroke of luck, so to speak, because the delay in doing the book made the book, I think, more relevant. Both Margaret and I have kids, not kids anymore, youngins who are in their 20s. One's actually even 30 now. He may be lurking out there, Joe, my son. As we were working on the book, the George Floyd murder tragically occurred in Minneapolis. And then there was a whole new wave of radical activism all across the country, that kind of protest and kind of energy we hadn't seen, frankly, since I was their age, back in the 60s and 70s. And that was inspiring to Margaret and me. And of course, our kids were out there being involved in that kind of, in this new wave of protest as well. So in a way, I think what we were trying to do was make it relevant for the next generation. People are trying to move American history forward. And we need to keep doing that, even more so now. You know, I wrote a blog the other day about how we need another, our movement needs another January 6th kind of moment. We need a fierce sense of urgency right now. And I think that's what so many young people are feeling. And I think the book, the lessons, as Margaret said, the turning points in these revolutionary leaders' lives in the 60s and 70s, they were flawed human beings. We don't try to sugarcoat that. We write about them with great honesty, I think, but great also empathy. And I think it's important that the new generation of activists learn these lessons as well.
You know, and it really, I'm glad you brought that up, because it seems so clear to me, you know, when you read this book, that the arc of the moments that you highlight extend into the present when we look at like Black Lives Matter and you know, the indigenous struggles against the pipelines and you know, Green New Deal and things like that. I mean, all the way through to, you know, the protests in Seattle for WTO, Occupy Wall Street, and what have you. There's a kind of a continuum here that I'm seeing. And could you comment on that a little bit? Because it really, you know, you can connect the dots. And I feel like, you know, this book is doing something like that.
Margaret,
Yeah, I mean, one area, and I know David will want to comment on some of the specific movements you brought up, but I think a lot about the women's liberation movement and the work that it did around reproductive rights, and how urgently that is still before us as we look at these increasingly strict abortion laws in Texas and Mississippi, the one that's going to be coming before the Supreme Court next term, and so on. And you know, one of the chapters is about this underground woman-run underground abortion providing collective in Chicago that in the years before Roe v. Wade actually trained themselves to perform abortions for women who needed them, and had a remarkable safety record, actually. Did about 10,000 abortions and did them safely. So they were able to kind of take matters into their own hands, literally, and to offer this kind of mutual aid DIY approach that you do see in some movements today, and you see it in the reproductive rights movement sphere as well. There are groups like Women on Waves that are helping women who want to self-manage their abortions by providing medication to them directly, and other kinds of activism that do that direct kind of work. And there is, I think, a real continuum with that late 60s and 70s women's health movement, women's liberation, do-it-yourself approach.
Yeah, I think that's one very relevant chapter. Another, I think, is our chapter on Wounded Knee in the American Indian movement, the stand that they took there in South Dakota in 1973, an action that many people have forgotten about, but was incredibly brave. Over 200 Native American warriors, local Lakota tribes people, but people from all around the country, convened there and retook that very sacred place where in 1890 a terrible massacre had occurred. George Custer's regiment mowed down some over 200, maybe as many as 300 men, women, and children. And as I write in the book, this was a courageous stand. They were immediately surrounded by militarized police, sheriffs, federal marshals, FBI. They sustained over 500,000 rounds of gunfire. And again, these were, you know, for the most part, largely unarmed people who were only had the power of prayer and a few guns themselves to hold off this amazing force. I wrote about this recently for Graydon Carter's new magazine called Airmail. There was an amazing incident at one point, and Dennis Banks told me this shortly before he died, at his 80th birthday. I sat down with Dennis, who was one of the founders of the American Indian movement and one of the leaders at Wounded Knee. He said at one point, the FBI and the Justice Department came to President Nixon and said, look, we want to go in, lay down a blanket of gas with helicopters, and basically retake it violently and kill whoever resists. It would be another massacre on the same site where 80 years before the original Wounded Knee massacre had occurred. Nixon, of all people, and we of course think very differently about him today, resisted this and said, do you mean to say that a bunch of ragtag Indians has you on the run? It turns out that Nixon had a kind of fondness for Native Americans because his coach at Whittier College had been Native American. So only he was able to prevent this a second massacre. And yet they were convinced that Dennis Banks would be taken like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse in the earlier century and killed when they surrendered finally, which they had to do some 71 days after the occupation, Wounded Knee. I call that chapter The Great Escape. And Dennis's escape from Wounded Knee, led by a young Navajo named Lenny Foster, who I also had the honor of interviewing, is an amazing story and should be a movie, I think. How he got out there to fight another day. And that is the Native American, I think, motto. We live to fight another day. I was the Standing Rock. It was a victory, of course, until Trump was elected. Then it wasn't a victory. Now, who knows what will happen to the pipeline there. But Native Americans, as we know, are fighting another, even more dangerous pipeline, Line 3 in Minnesota, rather. That fight for the protection of tribal waterways is not just their fight, it's all of our fight. They know that water sustains life on the planet. It's a fight that we all have to support. And that's why I was at Standing Rock. And that's why we all have to be aware of what's going on in Minnesota today. So we live to fight another day. It's that Native American warrior spirit that I think the movement today has to have, that we can't just fight one day and then go take a nap and think we elected Biden, so it's all over. It's never all over, unfortunately. American democracy is always at risk. And that's, I think, one of the key themes of this book. The people in our book, whatever flaws they had as human beings, whatever mistakes they made politically and personally, and they made a lot of them, and we talk about them, they were still warriors and they took a stand and they wouldn't give up.
Yeah, I wanted to jump back in to say that I noticed in the chat that Heather Booth, who is a key character in the book, one of really the founder of the Jane Collective, said that she is here with us.
Yay.
And she went on to an incredible career as an organizer and political force on the left, and but started the Jane Collective as the abortion service as a 20-year-old student at the University of Chicago in 1965. So kind of an amazing, gutsy move on her part, and was able to do it originally because she had also been politicized as a student in Mississippi in 1964 during Freedom Summer. And so when she got a call from a friend whose sister needed an abortion and was looking for help, she didn't know how to do that, but she knew the sort of civil rights scene and was able to find a doctor, a Black doctor in Chicago who was had been part of the civil rights movement in the South and had moved to Chicago and was able to step in and do some of the abortions initially. So anyway, those connections a lot of people, of course, in our book are people who came out of the civil rights movement, Freedom Summer, and so on. And hers was kind of a direct connection from early on.
Yeah, I think the coalition building, and Heather was so instrumental and so expert at doing that, reaching across different political and class and race lines to build movements, is another important theme of our book. I don't think people realize the extent to which Tom Hayden, Bobby Seale, John Lennon, Heather Booth, they all knew each other and often worked together politically. And were, and I think that's what the Chicago 8 trial was all about. Nixon just threw a bunch of leaders, many, some of whom didn't even know each other, into the same box and put them on trial for conspiracy and incitement to riot in Chicago after the Democratic Convention in '68. But, you know, it's true that people did conspire. People got together, people worked together. Bill Zimmerman is another amazing figure in a book. I don't know if Bill is out there somewhere, but Bill, like Zelig, kept popping up at different key moments. He too, like Heather, went to the South during the civil rights voter registration drives as a young man. He later flew the airplane and risked his life over Wounded Knee and dropped supplies to Dennis Banks and the others gathered there. It was a moment when they were starving and they desperately needed that airlift. Bill Zimmerman also helped organize the May Day protests against the Vietnam War. He then established the relief agency that helped send supplies, medical supplies to Southeast Asia. And he somehow popped up in Los Angeles and helped run Tom Hayden's campaign, was the campaign director actually for Tom Hayden's campaign for Senate in 1976. That we say was an important turning point, by the way, because the left has not, I think, in my estimation, valued electoral politics sufficiently, the new left rather, until this century. And so Tom Hayden's run for Senate back in 1969, jumping from the new left, from the anti-war movement into the electoral arena, was a key turning point. And the left took many years to, I think, build on that lesson that running for office and winning office is important in America.
But you also found in your Panthers chapter that Bobby Seale was, you know, seriously interested in electoral politics in a way that a lot of people haven't recognized.
Yeah, that's true. I interviewed Bobby about that. Bobby said that the use of guns and confronting the police, and there was a dramatic story that he acted out for me because Bobby is as he's quick to say, used to be a stand-up comedian, a jazz drummer. He's good on stage. So he acted out this whole scene with me in West Oakland when the Panthers, he and Huey Newton and a dozen other Panthers confronted an Oakland cop who was harassing an African-American citizen on the street yet again for the first time. And they confronted him with guns, but they knew the law inside and out. Huey did. He'd read the law. He was a law student. And he knew what they could do in the way of observing a policeman going about his business. But Bobby knew that guns were a explosive, so to speak, way to get to inspire the Black community and to get their attention. But he quickly wanted to pivot from that into, as you say, Margaret, electoral politics. And it took him years, a few more years, but he finally did run for mayor of Oakland in 1973. And I think in some ways that was the pinnacle of the Panthers' influence. And he lost, and the organization imploded because of repression from the outside and because of its own demons within Huey Newton's problems and so on. But I think Bobby's goal of turning the Panthers into an electoral machine was a very valid goal. And unfortunately, they failed to do that.
I'm just going to jump in to say we'll have time for questions at the end, but Heather Booth points out in the chat that there are so many movement heroes on this phone call, and I don't know if we'll get to cite everybody, but I am thrilled that you're all here. And I know she mentioned Connie Field, who made one of the great films about the civil rights movement, Freedom on My Mind, which I'm sure many of you have seen. But anyway, thrilled to have so many people who are part of this history on the call.
Margaret, let me ask you a question.
Yeah, hit me.
Speaking of Heather, a question that I think will come up a lot for us. So our book does revolve around these leaders,
Mhm.
flawed human beings, but leaders who were visionary and charismatic and changed history in conjunction with the movements they led, of course, and many unsung people as well. But our book makes an argument for the value of leadership. And so we've done a lot of thinking about this. And how would you answer the criticism from younger activists that leaders are a problem and that you need more sort of a horizontal kind of structure rather than a vertical structure? And that leaders get assassinated, or they become corrupt, or they sell out, or so on. How would you answer that criticism?
Well, I know that that is a kind of a hardy perennial issue in social justice movements, right? I mean, it was an issue. It was discussed, by many of the people, and debated and fiercely debated by many of the people that we're writing about. Certainly in the women's liberation, movement, there was a lot of kind of punishment of women who stood up too much, or became kind of national figures and didn't seem sisterly enough, or didn't seem, in some cases self-abnegating enough, who were kind of putting themselves out there. And I think, there have been a lot of critiques of that. The feminist Joe Freeman, among others, has written about that, wrote about that at the time, her famous essay on trashing. And I think we kind of learned the lesson that you don't want to punish people who have singular talents. That you want people to be able to, if they are able to powerfully articulate a vision, you need that, right? Yes, social justice movements need to keep their leaders accountable. They need to be democratic. They need to, be wary of people who are, by temperament or whatever it is, kind of power hungry. But I think we saw through this book the many ways, including some creative and not obvious ways, that leadership is important. And, for example, in the chapter that's on the gay rights movement around Stonewall, the character that we focus on there is not a super well-known person. His name is Craig Rodwell. He opened the first LGBTQ bookstore in the country, probably in the world, in New York in the late 60s. And but his significance in this chapter is that he wanted to frame and commemorate Stonewall, the Stonewall uprising. So, Stonewall was an amazing night, but there had been other nights where people in gay bars and cafeterias, like Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco, had resisted raids, had stood up, and he saw the significance of this event as not just that night, but as a chance to show that gay people were capable of resistance, and trans people, and he felt that the most important thing about it was to actually have a public commemoration of it a year later. So he and others, but he was instrumental in coming up with this idea for what he called then the Christopher Street Liberation Day, which was a year after the Stonewall Uprising. So it was in June 1970, and it became the first Pride Parade. And the visibility that the Pride Parade brought and has continued to bring has been crucial. But somebody had to kind of think of this. Had to kind of recognize the significance of this moment at the time it was happening, and decide that it had to be elevated and named and commemorated and marched about. And you see that, you mentioned, last summer's protest, BLM protests, and the murder of George Floyd. The murder of George Floyd, was a horrendous event that was captured on video, and that's part of the reason that it became the spark that it was. But it's also because people recognized that they had to talk about it that way, and they had to come out in the streets and frame it as a turning point. So I think that kind of leadership, where somebody recognizes a turning point as it's happening, calls it a turning point, and then through sheer force of will makes it a turning point, is an important kind of leadership that, you know, there's a little different from maybe what we think of as conventional leadership, but is an important thing that an important kind of move that I think we saw in a lot of the research for this book.
Yeah, and I think that it does take a unique person. We quote Martin Luther King in our introduction saying it takes a crazy person, really, a kind of craziness, to stand up to the kind of overwhelming power of the government and police, angry citizens who want to do you harm. And of course, Martin Luther King, everyone thinks of such a paragon of nonviolence, which he was, a follower of Gandhian philosophy, but he had arms, he had guns in his house to protect his family against the multiple threats, death threats that they received all the time. So I think it does take a certain craziness to stand up against that kind of repression. And so these are extraordinary people, I think, that we're writing about in the book. And I say we're writing about it with great honesty, flaws and all, warts and all, but yet there is this amazing courage. I think another common theme in the book is the resistance against police brutality, and we're seeing that again today. Not only with George Floyd, but even incidents during the George Floyd trial when more African-American citizens were murdered. It's unbelievable, it's systemic. And of course, there's a new book called America on Fire, which I also recommend. And you can buy that also from City Lights, as you should our book, by the way, a plug for City Lights, because it again shows that this violence against citizens, particularly African-American citizens, people of color, is systemic. And when people stand up against it, whether it's Bobby Seale and Huey Newton in the streets of Oakland, or whether it's the people in Stonewall and against the raids that kept victimizing people, gays and lesbians in New York City. It takes a kind of crazy courage, and then it takes I think a visionary leadership to see that as a turning point, as you were saying, Margaret. And not many people are able to do that, to see, you know, why is it that one incident sets off a kind of movement like a collective uprising and others don't. It takes leadership to do that, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. David, do you want to talk a little bit about the John Lennon chapter? Because, you know, John Lennon, obviously there's been a lot written about John Lennon, but I was surprised by some of what you found about this very this particular chapter in his and Yoko Ono's. It's very much about the two of them in their life, where they were living in the village in New York, and they really intersected. Again, it's one of these moments where these intersections are really kind of surprising, with all kinds of figures. I mean, with you know, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, and with Kate Millett, you know, the feminist author of Sexual Politics, and with the Panthers. Lennon was really struggling with kind of what his political contribution could be and so on. But how did you kind of get on to that passage? Because that was that passage of his life and their life together and their political journey.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating. It was John and Yoko's year of living dangerously. And they were living, as you say, down in Greenwich Village in a little apartment that was owned by Joe Butler, who was the drummer for Love and Spoonful. And they were tired of living, you know, in glitzy hotel rooms. They wanted to live down among their people, around artists and others who lived in Greenwich Village. And they were friends with Merce Cunningham, or Yoko was, from her days as a younger artist. And so they did. They moved down to this small apartment. And as you say, this flow of unlikely people, a lot of them radicals, came through the apartment. Kate Millett, Stu Albert, who was another yippie, Abby Hoffman, and so on, Jerry Rubin. And the way I found out about this was I was reading from the chapter we did on the Black Panthers, an old history with Panthers. And I found that the guy I'd never heard of, he's basically a bodyguard, a Black Panther bodyguard, showed up one day. He was ordered to come to John Lennon and Yoko Ono's apartment in the village by Huey Newton, because John had to go uptown to play that night at a benefit for the families of people who'd lost loved ones at Attica, the prison uprising in upstate New York. And it was, of course, a searing moment in history, in American history, New York history. And there was a benefit going to be held at the Apollo Theater. Aretha Franklin was due to perform, John Lennon, and a number of other people. And Huey Newton thought, given the kind of raw feelings at the time, he should have an escort. So the Panthers took John Lennon up to Harlem that night. He performed Imagine and a song he wrote about Attica. And when I heard about this, that he'd hung out with the Panthers, he went out to dinner later, that he felt very comfortable with them, that the song he wrote, if you read lyrics that John was writing at the time, that year in particular, but really, throughout his post-Beatle period, the songs he was writing were more and more radical and very introspective songs, and then songs about the world at large and injustice and racism and sexism. It blew my mind. I'd always been a Beatles fan. I'd always been a Lennon fan. I knew he'd gotten more political, but I didn't realize how committed he had become and who he was hanging out with, and the extent to which the Nixon administration saw him as a threat. And of course, John Wiener, who's a mutual friend of ours, the historian, has done great work in this area on the Nixon and the FBI, and how they saw John as a major threat to Nixon's reelection in '72. They were deathly afraid, and his original plan was indeed to go around the country, organize the youth vote against Nixon, and get rid of him. Nixon declared war on him. And the surveillance and the firepower and the FBI kind of harassment directed then at John Lennon and Yoko, and were amazing, and shows, again, I think, the power of radical celebrity. I think John became isolated increasingly. It's too difficult, I think, for celebrities, particularly when they're on their own. He and Yoko had each other, of course, but that wasn't good enough. Jane Fonda had more of a movement and had an organization behind her with Tom Hayden. The Indochina Peace Campaign and the Campaign later for Economic Democracy were statewide organizations in California that I think helped sustain Jane through a lot of the pressure and harassment and threats that she was receiving also. So I think, another lesson of our book is you need to protect your celebrities, frankly. You think of celebrities as these super human people who don't need our care and our support, and the same with leaders. But I think we need to take care of our leaders and our celebrities, particularly when they commit themselves to movements and causes that we care deeply about. And we know how much kind of firepower is being directed at them from government.
How vulnerable that makes it.
agencies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. That's true. That's true. Hey, should we take
Open
some
it up.
questions?
Yeah, let's.
Yeah. Peter?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
we've got a few comments here.
Questions, comments?
Let's see. Jim asks, I'm also interested in the JFK question. What was the connection between the assassination and the movement that came later? What was the resonance between his critique of the military-industrial complex and the anti-Vietnam's movement?
That's got David Rich all over it.
I go into that more in The Devil's Chessboard, my book that came out, also a Harper Collins book a few years ago, and in The Brothers, an earlier book. But I think assassination is an important question that we should deal with here, and Margaret and I can both deal with that. Craig Rodwell, who Margaret writes about in the Stonewall chapter, very visionary activist in New York, was lovers with Harvey Milk. And I think the assassination of Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone in San Francisco set back the cause of sort of progressivism many years in this city. Was really a mortal blow in many ways. In fact, Cleve Jones, who was a young activist who was close to Harvey Milk at the time, later told me his first feeling was that it was the death of the gay rights movement when you kill a leader like Harvey Milk. So we talked about the death and the murder of Fred Hampton, an outrageous assassination by a death squad organized by the FBI and the Cook County DA's office. And it, murdered him in his bed while he was lying drugged, by the way, by a police informer, lying with his pregnant wife, and just shot him to death in his bed. Of course, we now have the movie about this that came out last year, which was, I thought, really important. But I think assassination is a tool of power. It's been used repeatedly in this country against leaders. We examine the charge even if John Lennon was assassinated. His son, Sean Lennon, felt that way and told New Yorker magazine that he was killed for political reasons. We couldn't confirm that. But I do think that assassination in many cases has been used as a political tool. From my earlier books, I feel that about the Kennedy brothers, about Martin Luther King, about Malcolm X. And about 2 years ago, I got a kind of a very distinguished list of people, everyone from Daniel Ellsberg to two surgeons who worked on President Kennedy at Dallas's Parkland Hospital as he lay dying, a vast range of people who signed a letter saying the investigations into the murders of President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King should be reopened because there's still many unanswered questions there. We now know about Malcolm X, that his assassination was probably organized by elements of the Nation of Islam, where he'd broken from, and the FBI that were collaborating with each other. So I think, yes, sadly and tragically, leaders are picked off in this country, and the assassination is a political weapon, not just in the US, but other parts of the world, of course. And we need to find better ways of protecting our leaders.
I have a question about social media. Considering everything we've learned from the past, what are the advantages that we have now versus, what existed for the period of time that you've covered in the book?
Margaret, why don't you go?
Yeah, I mean, I still do feel that probably the most, important thing is getting people out in the streets, is getting, bodies kind of on the line. However, you saw, for example, in the BLM demonstrations last summer, that the ability to mobilize people really quickly through all kinds of social media, particularly for, younger people, got a lot of people out in the streets, including in parts of the country that don't usually see large scale demonstrations or haven't in, rural parts of the country, small towns. So I think the capacity for mobilizing people is through social media is remarkable. But for me, that feels like step one, and step two is getting out and doing the actual marching and organizing and IRL activism. But David, you're in a way more of a social media person than I am, so maybe you have something more to add to that. I don't know.
Well, no, I think it is obviously a tool, a useful tool, and I use it a lot, and I know many people do use it, particularly younger generation. But I agree with you, Margaret. I see it as one tool, but it doesn't replace all the hard work that needs to be done. It can amplify it, but in terms of voter registration, getting people out to vote, getting people to join unions, all that old-fashioned stuff that people were doing that we wrote about in our book, still I think is crucial. I mean, thank God for Stacey Abrams and the voter registration, the hard grassroots work that she did for years and months.
Mm-hmm.
Right now we have this fragile, 50-50 kind of Senate situation. And Joe Manchin, of course, has made things even worse in the last couple of days. But at least we have two Democratic senators from Georgia because of her work. So that's the kind of, I think, gutsy grassroots work that we sometimes overlook, but is heroic.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I have a comment here. Did you speak at all to David Victor Harris, the nation's first radical college student body president at Stanford? His book, Dreams Die Hard, about his time with Allard Lowenstein was amazing.
We didn't talk to David.
did
I know
not.
David's been sick. He's been seriously ill for some time now. He's a hero. I've talked to David in the past or communicated with David in the past. In fact, he signed my statement about the importance of reopening the investigations into the murders of these American heroes. And I have great respect for what he did as a young anti-war activist, willing to go to prison for his beliefs. And that's what it takes, of course, in many cases. You have to be willing to put your body on the line. That's what the people at Standing Rock, at Wounded Knee, the Black Panthers who went into the streets against violent and racist cops. You know, all these people, Martin Luther King, every day of his life was putting his body on the line. And of course, some people suffered the ultimate, I think, sacrifice. And without that, America would not be pushed forward historically. So thank God for people like David Harris. Again, they're heroes. He's not one of the people in our book, but I consider him a hero.
So I have another comment here. 20 states are considering approval of a total ban on teaching about slavery, Reconstruction, and lynching. Your book would, based on banning critical race theory, also probably never make it to a library at the University of Idaho, Texas, Mississippi, etc. Can you comment on this?
Yeah, I find it so amazing that we are having this discussion at this point, that, you know, this attitude of sort of see no evil, hear no evil about America's history of enslavement and the legacy of enslavement is just extraordinary. I can't believe that it's anything more than a sort of last gasp, but and I feel like the kind of weight of really important books, scholarship, discussion of that history is just so overwhelming and so kind of inspiring that I can't imagine that these kind of you know, weak arguments for ignoring it all are going to prevail for long. But it is extraordinary that we are still having the debate about whether it's okay to acknowledge slavery and its legacy in teaching America's school children. It's mind-boggling.
I mean, I felt inspired and also completely dismayed when I reread the Black Panthers 10-point program that Bobby Seale and Huey Newton wrote when they started the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense over 50 years ago. And you should read it. It's, I mean, the demands are still, I think, relevant, sadly, tragically, today. The demands to end police violence against their community, the demands for equal access to employment and education and decent housing, the demands for reparations for slavery, the demands to end Jim Crow justice and sort of systematic incarceration of Black Americans. I mean, these were the demands of the Black Panther Party over 50 years ago, and we're still fighting for them today, and they still seem out of reach today, I think, to many of us. So the book is inspiring, but it's also, you know, it tells us how much we need to up our game, frankly. And, you know, we saw this resurgence last year, as we've been talking about, but it's not good enough to have just these spasms of protest. They need to be organized, they need to be led, we need to have a culture of resistance that doesn't exist right now. I mean, you know, when I think of the music, our brother Steve is doing a documentary about the wave of anti-war protests in 1969, when Nixon and Kissinger were threatening to use the madman strategy and threaten North Vietnam with nuclear weapons, and came close, you know, probably to using them. And we've done that many times in our history, come close after Hiroshima and Nagasaki to using them again against, civilian populations. And so it took a wave of anti-war protests to prevent Nixon and Kissinger from doing this, from going nuclear. And the music, Pete Seeger, John Lennon, Richie Havens, at these protests was just, we assumed that was part of our culture. Peter, Paul, and Mary and others went on Joan Baez. We were talking about David Harris. Joan Baez was married to David Harris for a while. Dylan, I just watched Don't Look Back, the amazing Penny Baker documentary on Dylan's tour of England, I think in 1965 it was, in black and white, and just what an amazing character he was, and the kind of genius of his songwriting. And, so it's not just politics, we need a culture of resistance now to bring people together from all races, from all, I think, generations, from all, backgrounds. And that's the sense we had back in those days, in the 60s and 70s, that we had this one big movement. Martin Luther King was trying to put that together when they killed him. And I think they killed him for that reason. That was the final straw, the people who wanted him out. He was trying to lead a poor people's march that included every strain of resistance in America. Bobby Seale, and this blew my mind, told me that he had Ralph Abernathy, his right-hand person, call up Bobby Seale from the Panthers and say, would you join my Poor People's March on Washington? And Bobby Seale, everyone thought, well, that will never happen. The Panthers are way too militant for someone like Martin Luther King. No, King reached out to Bobby Seale, and Bobby Seale said enthusiastically, yes, I would be honored to join your march and to occupy Washington. The point of that was not just to march on Washington, it was to occupy Washington. They were going to occupy Washington in 1968 until Congress diverted funding from the Vietnam War to urgent domestic projects and issues. So it was a radical thing. And I don't think they wanted Martin Luther King to pull together a movement of that power, a coalition of that power. And so I think others tried to take up, of course, his banner afterwards, but no one had the kind of charisma. I think the visionary leadership, the spiritual leadership in many ways of Martin Luther King. So again, it shows you the importance of these leaders, how they make a difference, a huge difference, and how they need to be protected.
I have another question. Do you think one of the shortcomings of the 60s generation of political leaders was a lack of intergenerational organizing? Instead of making common cause with leftists who came before them, that the generation of radicals seemed very focused on making a break with the past, quote unquote, don't trust anyone over 30, et cetera. What could today's generation of leaders learn from looking back at this legacy?
Well, Margaret, you read the Port Huron statement. You had some interesting things to say about that, of course. And Heather, if she wants to comment on that, of course, Heather's late husband, Paul Booth, was involved in, I think, writing that statement. And that statement in some ways was the founding statement of the New Left. And I think there was a feeling among people in that generation that the old left, particularly the Communist Party affiliated left, was too stuck on foreign ideologies, was too stuck on dogma that didn't make sense any longer to a younger generation. And there needed to be a radical break from it. And partly it was the Cold War, of course. The Cold War, I think, unfortunately, had vilified, had demonized the old left. And so there was this kind of historic break between generations, not entirely of the new left's making, but also because of Cold War propaganda, frankly. And I think that was a mistake. It was a mistake. And I think the new left then had to learn its way, sort of find its own way without the advice of elders. And what Tom Hayden called it, a crisis of elders. What he looked around and saw the elders of all, and this is in the Democratic Party, and we're so-called Cold War liberals too. We're all devoted to the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and so those people had to be broken away from. So it wasn't, I wouldn't just put it on young people and young activists. I think the older generation was wedded to some vision of America as an imperial power. And that, kind of embrace of America as an imperial power coming out of World War II, I think was kind of a death grip that the older generation wouldn't let go. And it took the anti-war movement to really finally break that grip.
Yeah. And Peter, I think Heather had a comment.
Yeah, let me unmute Heather for a moment.
Unmute Heather.
Wait, mostly my comment is to thank you so much for having written this, for having shared the history. So many people of the current generation don't know this history. Many of us may even have forgotten some of it. And thank you also for your generosity in including me in the book. My comment just on youth leadership is that I had two thoughts. One, that part of what made the New Left was that it was a break from McCarthyism, which had forced the leadership from an older generation underground or in jail or away from politics, because and made it illegal to have progressive ideas, to be against lynching, to be for voting for all. And the New Left, part of what was new of the New Left is it was this break, that we wouldn't just say we'll play the Cold War politics of having to criticize the Soviet Union at each point, that we had to criticize the US. And there was an internal rift over that. And then also the New Left, we had to learn about how you do organization, how you do sustain leadership, how do you have leadership who sustain other leaders, how women can also be leaders, how Black people are leaders in their own organizations, and maybe we have to find ways that we have a more integrated society. There's a lot of things we've learned since then, and a lot of things we knew that we can still pass on. Anyway, thank you so much for having written this book. I haven't read it, and I look forward to reading it.
Good. Thank you.
Thanks. It's great to hear. Heather Booth is a giant of this period, and not just this period, but continued to be active throughout her life. So thank you so much, Heather.
Absolutely.
I wanted to add to what she said, that yes, the New Left had to invent its own way, because the communist left, the old left, had been forced underground, had been imprisoned, had been depoliticized by government pressure and so on. And we were aware of that. But one of the lessons we did learn also, I think that was a good lesson, the New Left, was that we had to make a uniquely American, I think, left, and not be so tied to Moscow, to foreign ideologies. And in fact, Bill Zimmerman told me, and Bill was a member, of course, the New Left, as I said earlier, was very active in many different aspects of it. Bill told me that when he and Tom Hayden decided to run a campaign for Senate in '76, they had to kind of relearn about America, because they've been so influenced by, sort of foreign leaders and foreign ideologies, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, Che, and so on. And so they had to learn to speak an American lexicon again, in a way, in a vernacular, and to find out what was important to American people. So I think that was a useful discipline. And, I know, Heather, you've gone into electoral politics a lot in your life, worked on the Harold Washington campaign, among other things that Bill Zimmerman also did for mayor in Chicago, first African-American elected mayor. So, I think, electoral politics kind of is limited, in some ways, but also it imposes a useful discipline also on leftists.
Well, we have just about run out of time here. We have so many more comments and questions, but I'm hoping that, we'll be able to kind of continue these kinds of dialogues into the future. Congratulations to you both. This is such a remarkable book, and City Lights, of course, is so proud to be featuring it, and we're really very grateful that you made this the launch party.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to everybody. Great to see you virtually.
Yes. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, y'all. Take care.